Let's start by talking to a friend of the show, Jack. Uh, Jack, you wanted to talk a little bit more about the news coming out of OnlyFans. What's on your mind tonight?
Yeah, particularly what interests me is like your thoughts on payment processors being the ones that are seeming to control this stuff. Because although they seem to be like OnlyFans seems to be making a move towards being more mainstream by removing sexually explicit content, that seems to be driven by these payment processors having rules about it. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on them controlling it specifically, like them legislating morality.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to dive a little bit more into some of these details, but at the same time, I don't know how much is going to really surprise me. I want to point out that we actually kind of predicted that this was coming. I think when we talked to Amberly Rothfield about this idea as much as like a year and a half ago, that was sort of a thought that this could be a possibility, and certainly the writing has kind of been on the wall about it. So it's definitely upsetting without necessarily being shocking. But as to your specific question about the role of the payment providers, I of course am frustrated and upset about the kind of homogenous nature of that idea that these giant corporations are being sex negative in that way to appeal to a certain base. But I think even more significantly, without knowing all the details, and while we're still in sort of this like preliminary stage of putting our thoughts together, it feels like this is not entirely different from the situation with Tumblr and Fosta Sesta, just in the sense that the financial deplatforming was what ultimately drove the decision, and that financial deplatforming was driven by legislation, which basically is just a very complicated way of saying a bunch of politicians decided that they could score easy political points by using sex workers as scapegoats and started to create a lot of legislation and put a lot of pressure on these payment providers, and now they have all gotten in line. I know you definitely have a good bit of experience here, Jack. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, obviously anger at this, but again, a lack of surprise. I remember it being talked about on the show and also in sex worker circles in general. I think what is interesting me about this kind of change with payment processors is that you also see this kind of stuff with queer content, right? Where often there will be problems with payment processing, specifically of stuff that focuses on queer people. But the difference with that is that people can challenge it, like legally, because it is illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of sexuality or gender identity in a lot of places. But that isn't true of sex work in particular, or sexual expression in general, more broadly. So I'm wondering, like, in general, if any of you have thoughts on making that something that is protected, like sexual expression or sex work specifically, maybe, as a way that would allow people to combat stuff like this and sue payment processors even.
Yeah, I'm absolutely in favor of creating a protected class that would include sex workers. I feel like that is desperately needed for so many reasons, and reasons that we've detailed on this show with your help a little bit more thoroughly. So I'm definitely going to provide links to that episode. Beyond that, I have to say I haven't had time to really collect my thoughts here, but I know that this is going to hurt a lot of people. And I know that those people are going to, naturally be sex workers, but also are going to be disproportionately queer folks and disproportionately folks that are already marginalized, not just because of their situation in either of those two categories I already mentioned, but because of the fact that they were doing this type of work in the first place. It's not at all to suggest that all sex workers are just scraping the bottom of the barrel and working to make ends meet, but that is very much the case for a lot of people. And this is going to hit them really hard. I mean, to be clear, like, don't cry for me in any way, But I saw this news and I immediately thought about my caseload. I thought about the clients that I work with and how many of them are now going to be struggling to be able to afford their therapist if I'm not able to make accommodations. Beyond that, how many of them are going to be struggling to pay their rent and some of these ideas. So, I definitely want to take this platform to mention things like I want clips or mini vids or some of these other websites that are frankly a lot better than OnlyFans in terms of their ethics. But watching OnlyFans take this direction is going to have some wide sweeping implications for a lot of people. And many, many, many of those people are already marginalized and struggling during a global health crisis. So there's a lot to be anxious about here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, Jack, before we let you go, did Emily or Jack, did either of y'all have any last thoughts here?
The only thing that came to mind for me was the idea of monopolies, right? And any time in a society where you have just a few companies who are in charge of something, then it's very easy for legislation or for people who run those companies to make decisions that affect millions of other people. So anti-monopoly rallies, anti-capitalist rallies, like just let me know the time and place and I'll be there.
Fair to say. Well, Jack, thank you so much for calling in and for continuing to just raise the alarm about the plight of sex workers in this day and age.
Yeah, thanks for talking about it.
Absolutely. Take care.